I'm going to talk.
Recording is on.
Well, I'm going to talk about Livewire and how you can use it in your PHP Laravel applications. But before I do, I want to take a moment to, let's see, I'm going to share my screen here. Alrighty. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Great. Fantastic. All right. So I want to take a moment to invite you to join my new startup that I just started yesterday called Swatcher. And we're using state-of-the-art technology to solve a big problem in the tech industry, which is color swatches and how people build them, how they find them, how they manage them. It's a huge problem. This is, as far as I know, the only solution. If you're interested in investing, we're accepting Bitcoin and Ethereum. But I'll just jump right to the demo so you can see what we got going on here. So this tool uses state-of-the-art blockchain technology to generate color swatches. You can see here we've got a very nice color swatch. And if we want another one, we can just click this button and it gives us unlimited swatches. Most color swatch applications, you're limited to maybe 1 or 2 at best, but this one, you can do it as many times as you want. You can see we've got some nice colors going on here. And we can even, just recently, we added a feature where you can actually change the number of colors. So we could go down, if you wanted a 3-color swatch, you could do that. Or maybe you just want 1 color, you can do that as well. Anyway, I'm very excited about this. This will be, if my new job at Firebrand doesn't work out, I'm going to double down on this as my future career. So if you're interested, I'll be available after the chat, after the talk, and I'd be happy to take your money. That said, let's get right into the presentation. So what if you never had to write JavaScript again? JavaScript is an amazing tool, but I think for a lot of people who focus on the back end, it can be a frustrating experience. The language is sort of all over the place, and it's kind of, wrapping your head around how the ecosystem works and everything. It's a lot, and I spent many years just trying to avoid JavaScript as much as I could. And it really wasn't until I discovered Vue that I sort of had the realization that maybe JavaScript was okay. And in fact, I like Vue.js so much that I am a co-organizer of the local Vue.js meetup here in Portland. But even then, even knowing that I organize a JavaScript meetup, even still, if I was given the opportunity to never have to write JavaScript again, I would jump at it. And there is now a tool called Livewire, which will let you do that in a Laravel application. It's the full name of the tool is Laravel Livewire, and it, we'll get into the details of how it works, but the basic idea is, it sort of wraps up some front-end, very generic front-end JavaScript and lets you manage it through HTML attributes. And it sort of, and then it defers a lot of the logic to the back end in a sort of specially built PHP class. So yeah, let's check it out. So most often when you're building with JavaScript, you're usually, either you're sprinkling in your JavaScript here and there, or you're doing something very big, like a single page application that is sort of a whole entity unto itself. And then maybe you have a backend API and there's some communication going on between the two. How do you get the data from the database into the SPA? There's a lot to figure out there. And having built a number of those type of applications myself, I find that they're really great in theory, but in practice, there's a lot of problems that you really have to address. And, of course, whole businesses have been built to solve those problems. But, nonetheless, as you're architecting these, the front end and the back end, you have to really be conscientious of how you're going to solve these various problems. Are you going to have your front end and your back end in separate repos so that you can deploy them independently? Are they in a mono repo that you're still deploying independently? There's some, code management logistics you have to sort out. Then, if you're doing data modeling in the database, are you going to duplicate those models, maybe with some sort of TypeScript model setup? I don't know. Are you going to have duplicate models on the front end and the back end? Are you going to have duplicate validation logic front end, back end? Probably, but still you have to implement it twice. If you have these internal API points that are just, pointing towards, they're just being consumed by your SPA, how are you documenting them? How are you managing drift in, what API endpoints are available and what's being returned? There's a lot to think about there. And on top of that, as I said earlier, JavaScript itself is just inherently complex. To do anything, it does amazing things, but it's a rabbit hole. It's really, to get things working in a very specific way, you really have to do a deep dive and manage a lot of complexity and sort of understand, how these disparate ideas in JavaScript work together, and how are you going to have your single page routing and all of that stuff. And and that's just in a single page application. If you introduce server-side rendering, that's a whole additional headache. So there's a lot going on there. And on top of all of that, if you want to have an authenticated user, if you want to have an authentication experience, then how are you going to handle the session management, basically? So there's a lot to think about when building an SPA. And in a lot of ways, those problems are either greatly reduced or non-existent if you just have a single, one application that's a server-side application. You just have one repo, you have one set of models and validation. Maybe you don't even need any API endpoints, or maybe you have a couple for third-party API access, or it's a lot. There's a lot fewer API endpoints are needed. And you might feel differently, but I tend to feel that PHP, just as a language, is a lot easier to understand and reason about than JavaScript is. And so, complexity in PHP is, you can make it as complex as you want, but there isn't necessarily a, inherent complexity out of the gate with PHP. And, handling session-based authentication in PHP is, almost trivial. This is a solved problem, and there's very little you have to do to get that up and running. So if there was a way to, how could we achieve all of the great things that a server-side, an SPA gives us in terms of user interaction, wouldn't it be amazing if we could do those same things on a server-side application, so we get this rich experience without having the headache of all of this extra JavaScript that we have to wrangle. A lot of people will do this by introducing an AJAX layer into their, their templates, and this is great, but it still requires JavaScript. You have to write JavaScript for the AJAX handling. What are you going to do with the data once you get it back? Now you've got more endpoints. So it works in theory, but in practice, you're still adding a lot of complexity to your application. Now, there's a new tool built by Caleb Porzio, who's a very big, prominent member of the Laravel community, called Livewire. And the idea of Livewire is that, it ships with a set of, sort of pre-built JavaScript, and that's some PHP classes that integrate with a Laravel application. And those two tools work together to allow you to build rich UI experiences that are managed almost entirely from the back end or through your HTML templating. So you don't have to write any JavaScript if you don't want. You can, of course, if you want to, but you don't need to get things working. It lets you keep track of your UI state on the back end if you want, and it integrates almost entirely with Laravel. In fact, you can't really use it outside of Laravel. The only way to really use Livewire right now is through a Laravel application. So you can use all your models, any service classes that you've got in your Laravel application, you can use with Livewire in this sort of rich UI experience. And it was built with testing in mind, so it's very easy to test the sort of user experience using just regular PHP unit. So how does it work? Like I said, it uses Ajax, and basically what it does is you put certain attributes into your template, and then the JavaScript that ships with Livewire will read those attributes on page load and then take certain actions based on that. So you might set up an event listener on a button, and then when that button is clicked, Livewire will send a communication from the front end to the back end using a special endpoint that is just for Livewire. And over the wire, it will send serialized data about the application state and what action is being taken. And then the server will respond with an HTML payload that then comes back, and then the screen is re-rendered. Basically the HTML that comes back is injected back into this page, and from the user point of view, it has a feel like a JavaScript experience. So it's entirely possible, with some caveats, I'll say, to almost entirely replace a single page JavaScript application with a Laravel Livewire setup and still have this idea of the rich user experience. We were talking about this a little bit earlier, but this idea is not new. It was originally, the first version of this was introduced with Phoenix LiveView. Phoenix is a web framework for the Elixir programming language. And the team that built Phoenix had this idea for a tool that would, do this exact thing, encapsulate JavaScript on the front end, and then, send HTML back, and then update the HTML in real time. And in Phoenix, Elixir makes it trivially easy to use WebSockets. So in Phoenix LiveView, they use WebSockets for this communication, but in Livewire, we're using Ajax. And then recently, just even a couple months ago, the Ruby community announced Hotwire, which is their answer to the same thing. I don't quite know how it works. I think it might also be WebSockets, but it's the same basic idea, sort of encapsulated JavaScript on the front end, and then HTML sent over the wire, which is kind of like TurboLinks, only this is a lot more than TurboLinks offers. Now, I will say that as great as Livewire is, there are certain things that are not really well suited for Livewire. Although, I guess that's a matter of judgment. But there's certain very trivial, quote unquote, trivial tasks that you might want to do in the front end that it doesn't really make sense to have a full, round trip server, request response cycle for. And when that is the case, there's a tool called alpine.js written by Caleb, the same guy who wrote Livewire, wrote this JavaScript tool. And it is really meant just as sort of a way to sprinkle very light touches of JavaScript wherever you need them. And Livewire and Alpine.js JS, they work together really, really well. And so, you know, I will at some point talk a lot more about Alpine.js in a separate presentation. I'm again, like I said, I'm the co-organizer of the Vue.js meetup, and I am at this point, I'm pretty sure that Alpine is probably my favorite JavaScript platform, at least at the moment. So I've got a lot to say about Alpine, and I'll be putting together a separate presentation for that in a couple months. So that said, let's look at some code. So if you haven't figured it out already, you know, my demo earlier, this is a little demo, Livewire demo application I put together. And what you're seeing here is, you know, all of this that you're seeing is happening in Livewire. So this is, I didn't write any JavaScript to get this working. And you can see that we have access to the query string, and it's, you know, it's reading from the query string and sort of modeling data from the query string. And, you know, we're not doing any full page reloads at all. It's all happening just over the wire. And you can see, if we look at the network tool here, you know, if we click this button, you know, it's when that happens, we're sending a post request to this Livewire endpoint. And, you know, it's sending data, some serialized data about the state of the UI to the backend. And then the backend does its thing, and it sends back HTML and some additional metadata that is then injected back into our Livewire div, basically. And so actually let's just bring up the application itself. So this is the application, and for the sake of this demo, it's a, you know, you can really get pretty complex. You know, Livewire has a lot to offer, which I'm not really showcasing a whole lot of in this repo. But if we look at the, you know, one thing that Caleb's pretty big about is the idea of sort of eliminating the need for controllers. And if you're using Livewire, you don't actually need to have any controllers. It will, you know, you can see here I've got this Livewire demo class that I've set up, and we're basically routing the /demo route directly into that component. So we're skipping the controller altogether here. And if we take a look at that component, it's not all that complicated. You know, there's two key methods that every Livewire component class requires. One is this mount method, and this is called whenever you first initialize the page. So when you go to the page for the first time, it runs the mount command, the mount method, and this lets us sort of set things up however we want. And then there's this render method, which is how the initial HTML is generated and then sent down to the browser. And here we're just, you know, we're using a blade template, and we're telling it, you know, use this blade template and then use this layout as the sort of parent layout for that template. And the interesting thing is that, you know, this render method is essentially dynamic. You know, every time you ping the Livewire backend, it will rerun that render method. So if you had if you set it up so that you were creating new model instances in, you know, by hitting a button on a page, it would, you know, every time you click the button, it runs the code to generate the model, and then it says, okay, before we return our response, let's rerun the render method and send that HTML back as part of the payload. So if you had say a table that was listing all those models, you know, you would click the button to create the new one, it would generate it, and then it would re-render the template. And now that you have this additional data, you'll see your newly created model show up in that HTML automatically. So here, let's take a look at this template. So I'm using Tailwind here, and which is why we've got all these classes. But you can see that we've got basically this section is the first, the sort of boilerplate that has all the fundraising speak. And then down here, this is where the actual logic is happening. So we're saying, for each of the available swatches, let's display this div that has that color selected. And this value, this swatch value, is coming from this component. This, all of the public properties on this class are available as values in the template that we're loading. So we can just reference it directly. So we just run through each one of those. And then down here, we have this button that says, generate a new one. And right here, this is where the magic happens. We have this wire:click directive. And this is saying to Livewire, the Livewire front end, it says whenever we click on this button, we want to execute the generate swatch method on the back end, which is right here. It's this method. So this is that sort of declarative syntax that lets us tell the JavaScript, Livewire JavaScript, what we want to have happen. So we're saying, run this method. And here, we're just saying, hey, let's reset our swatch array. And then for each, then just generate a bunch of colors as needed. And so it regenerates the values of this public property, and then it runs the render command, which sends back our updated HTML, which is how we get to seeing the new colors each time we generate them. And then this counter is similar. It's the same basic idea. We have a public count value. So this is where we're keeping track of the value of how many swatches we want. And in the template, we've got these two buttons here, one for incrementing the value of the counter, and another one down here for decrementing the counter. And again, we have that same wire:click attribute that says, hey, when someone clicks on this button, increment the count. Or if they click on this button, decrement the count. And that's running this increment and decrement method here. So here we're just saying, hey, bump up the count. And if we're going over our limit, then reset it. And here in the decrement, bring it down again. And the same thing happens, because each time we run these methods, before the response comes back, Livewire will rerun the render method. And that's pretty much it. That is Livewire in action. There's a lot, like I said, Livewire brings a lot to the table. It will, it's pretty easy to set up a pagination experience. You can use Livewire to paginate through data in a table. You can do nesting. You can have nested Livewire components that will communicate sort of with each other. And if you've used Laravel, you may have some experience with blade components, which is Laravel's preferred method for abstracting chunks of HTML that you might want to use over and over again. And it's pretty easy to, Livewire and blade components work very well together. And also, as I mentioned, there's, we're using the query string up here, and basically all I did to get that working was say, hey, just so I had this protected query string parameter, and I'm saying, I would like to model, I want to sync the value of this query string parameter with, the value of what's in the backend. Now, and that Livewire just does that automatically. One thing that comes up often is, because we're not using a controller, and because we're really only loading the class once and then just re-rendering, you might think, well, PHP is a stateless language. where is this component when, in between our requests? And basically what's happening is that Livewire is serializing everything it needs to, hydrate a new instance of this class is in the payload, which is a lot of this extra meta stuff is basically just whatever it needs to, so when the request comes in, Livewire picks it up, it says, okay, I see, what component this is for. I'm going to hydrate the component class and then call the method and then, do whatever I need to do and then send back the updated HTML and, re-serialize whatever's needed. So most of the state, quote unquote, of the PHP application is living in this payload that's going back and forth as part of your, basically your session. And the JavaScript tooling keeps track of that data as needed. Sometimes, it might, depending on what you're doing, it might use the cache. So if you have a cache set up, it might cache some data and then just read from the cache on each request. But that is, less common than it used to be. Livewire has been evolving quite a bit. So that said, any questions? No questions?
Where have you used that? In real life besides your demo?
I haven't used it in work, but I recently I rebuilt my whole personal technical blog using it, and it's really been fantastic.